There's a somewhat elaborate concept, known to many as samsara. It's an idea that the many chained lives of a particular being are filled with desires, and that all the suffering in those lives is due to those desires. Although I'm trapped deeply within my own desires, I did have a higher hope for Francisco. Consequently, I believed it was time for him to channel his inner spirit, his inner self, which was actually possibly me, technically. And as egocentric as that might sound, it was really up to me to take control of both his life and mine at the same time, a practice which was becoming increasingly exhausting. That's a little on the nose, but the plan was to grab a quick coffee and head out to the nearest park. Francisco could not brew his own coffee and the shop was serendipitously closed, all fine because I probably shouldn't have tried to fuel or incite Francisco's non-existent coffee habit anyway. It was about a 5-minute run to the peaceful park I had settled on, which was actually the golf course at which Francisco had built up his strength, an increase of 5% per game. Now it was time for him to build up his meditation strength, something I wasn't sure was technically possible, but if it was anything like golf, it would hopefully increase in 5% increments anyway. I saw a lot of avatar action options in the menu, but I couldn't find a way to get him to sit on the ground, so I drove a golf cart to what I thought would be a good meditation spot and parked it there. The awning hopefully protecting him from sunburn, stray golf balls, or grenades as we would meditate together. And that's I'm just going to start meditating now. The greatest difficulty of this pacifism and the aspirations within was that as time passed, no matter what activities I engaged in, I seemed to be making things worse for Francisco. Races caused damage, although unintentional, to vehicles and potentially people. Missions attracted greedy players or thugs and their respective weapons, and any activity tied to the economy and improving Francisco's financial status was intrinsically linked to the violence inherent within the game world. Every action had a consequence, and most of the time these consequences had a violent element to them, and I could not hide behind ignorance now that I had experienced so much of it firsthand. The solution as I understood it was to cease action entirely. If karma was real, if the Buddhist principle of samsara were real, it was the act of chasing worldly desires, selfishly or selflessly, that would inevitably lead Francisco down the circular endless path of pain and suffering, of wanting, not getting, or getting and wanting more. The solution, as traditional as it might seem, was to submit myself to the world, to submit mine and Francisco's attention to meditation, submit our intentions to empty our minds of desire and open our hearts, at least mine through him respectively. The golf cart meditation itself was slightly flawed. The sunset was beautiful and the moment was supported by the musical ambience, but for some reason, while sitting, Francisco wouldn't stop bobbing his head. Stillness, my aspiration, I moved him to look out at his apartment and closed my eyes, breathing in the stillness. So I breathed in the quiet, the stillness, and the sounds of the groundskeepers through the thunderstorms. But the universe would challenge us, and Francisco more than I. It took 2 back-to-back deaths before I could deposit all of his standing cash. If he didn't have any cash on his person, relative to Francisco without a destination, death had no effect, save the opportunity to move to a new place. This was a strangely rewarding way to change his perspective, something I was objectively rewarded for, and as I closed my eyes at each location, the only upsetting parts of this evening meditation process were his somewhat infrequent murders. I continued, however, to allow the universe through the game world to speak to us through its means and resources. Players would come and mess with him, knock Francisco down, and leave him on his own, and others would kill him. Although some, I believe, accidentally, as they would sometimes leave the game immediately thereafter. Soon this began to feel normal, as if this was a totally acceptable way to play the game. This new perspective led me to relate to the trees, like these trees in front of City Hall. With my eyes barely open, I felt they and I had a connection, a motionlessness and a peacefulness that came from not accomplishing something or going somewhere, but from simply existing. There was no consequence of death, except to be found in a new place, and as the rain fell or the sun shined, I was playing my own game. The goal of pacifism here, not to cease playing, but to be in a constant state of winning. Each new location was chosen by the game's creators either algorithmically or intentionally, and always had a new set of imagery to appreciate. It would be difficult to clear my mind at times, as screams of citizens often beset gunfire and the awful sound of defeat, but would often be met immediately after with a new life and a new place to experience it. One of these locations was this beach, wherein I continued to meditate.
Oh my God!
I wasn't afraid of the tank. Death was of no consequence, and Francisco had nothing to lose. And surprisingly, suddenly the tank lost. And although Francisco would eventually die, it would only be a few moments before he was simply somewhere else. In fact, at a certain point, I felt completely fine and somewhat intoxicated from this meditative experience, which had gone on for long over an hour. I was appreciating sound waves and occasional visual impulses while Francisco was staring into this wall. I was expecting nothing and feeling a strange connection with the game when suddenly Francisco didn't die. Instead, he was teleported to the airport by a player using a modified version of the game. The player could move other players around, and whoever the culprit was stacked all of us together and used some sort of external tool to explode all of us. I did this a few times, and at some point overloaded my game's connection and ceased the entire experience, severing my view from Francisco's. This whole ordeal felt strangely significant, as if the king of Samsara himself was combating me, as if this world couldn't handle the idea of passively appreciating it. And although Francisco might have never hurt any players and was still dying, perhaps it was me who deserved this pain. And if this was the value of meditation, to allow karma to wash over us instead of fleeing or pursuing it, then I was very excited to find out what would happen next, as Francisco surprisingly logged in within his apartment.